for joining us today this afternoon. My name is Jodie Gunn. I'm the CEO of the Australian Land Conservation Alliance, the peak body for private land conservation in Australia. I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and pay my respects to those on the countries that you're dialing in from today. Feel free to put your acknowledgements in the chat function on the screen there. I'd like to acknowledge that this global framework presents an opportunity to strengthen the rights and responsibilities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to continue their land stewardship responsibilities across Australia and in the implementation of this framework. Welcome to this two-part series. This is the second of two parts. The intent of this series is to continue to inform and to educate people about this important global biodiversity framework, and to start to tease out for people, particularly what it means globally and also, importantly, what it means for us here in Australia. A couple of instructions before we get started. Speakers are all on mute. They'll jump off when they're speaking. We can't hear or see you, but you have the ability to communicate with us through two functions. One is the chat function. That's for conversations, discussions among yourselves or to us to consider afterwards. And the Q&A function. Any questions you've got, we encourage you to put those into the Q&A function. We will have time for Q&A at the end, and I'll be going through those questions. You can also uptick questions. So the questions that get ticked up, we're more likely to be the ones that get answered during our Q&A. So encourage you to engage. Our panel is really keen to hear from you, not just from me. So in this first webinar, a couple of weeks ago, we focused on the framework as a whole. And today in this second webinar, we'll start to dive more deeply into some specific targets. I'm lucky enough to be joined today by a great panel of speakers with varying insights from their attendance and intentions at COP15 in Montreal. So with me today, I have Kelly O'Shannessy from the Australian Conservation Foundation. I've got Samantha Vine from BirdLife Australia, Rachel Lowry from WWF Australia, and James Fitzsimons from the Nature Conservancy in Australia. I'll just share my screen with you all. So we were lucky enough to be at COP15 in Montreal. And due to the nature of the challenge and the opportunity to present a united voice for conservation, we coordinated ourselves on the ground, drawing on our individual and organisational strengths to have the greatest impact that we could through our presence and our influence. And it really was a great pleasure to work with this panel and to get to know them individually and more deeply, and to share a once-in-a-lifetime experience that landed a really critical framework for nature that we are all truly committed to now implementing here in Australia. So on the 19th of December in 2022 in Montreal, parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity adopted the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. The adoption comes after 4 years of detailed negotiations and replaces the CBD's Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011-2020 and its IACHI targets. Tens of thousands of people were there, including a range of other Australian participants who made the long journey to Montreal in the thick of winter right before Christmas. It was cold, but that was okay. It was snowing, that was fun. It was busy, back-to-back meetings, buzz of thousands of people moving through the conference presentations, information, exhibitions, and behind the scenes, UN negotiations of country delegates, where observers, including ALCA and all of our panel here, were actively taking stock of the daily negotiations that would ultimately lead us to the framework that we have to work with today. So the framework, in summary, this final framework provides a really strong platform that provides levers for whole of society change. It's worth calling out the vision and the mission specifically. So the 2050 vision, by 2050, the biodiversity is valued, conserved, restored and wisely used, maintaining ecosystem services, sustaining a healthy planet and delivering benefits essential for all people. 2030 mission is to take urgent action to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, to put nature on a path to recovery for the benefit of people and planet. It contains 4 global 2050 goals and 23 global 2030 targets. So these targets are broken into 4 broad topics aligned to the goals, and we talk specifically to some of these today, not all of them. Reducing threats to biodiversity is one of those areas, nature's contribution to people, access and benefit sharing, and tools and solutions for mainstreaming and implementation. The framework outlines not only a set of goals and targets, which are more frequently referenced, but in addition, it sets out a range of considerations for the implementation, which include the contribution and rights of Indigenous people and local communities, different values systems, gender, whole of government and whole of society approach, collective efforts towards the targets, and also human rights-based approach, among other framework elements. So these elements inform and shape the implementation by nation states, Australia as one, and provide further consideration for our work within that Australian context. We won't, as I said, have time to go through every target in detail, but we will seek feedback after the forum and determine if you'd like one more seminar to dive further into more targets. It's something we possibly could do before the end of the month, but we'll explore today 6 particular targets. And we've provided links in the chat bar. We will provide some links for access to the detailed frameworks if you don't have those. So to get to know the panel a little bit more, before we dive into the targets ourselves, I'd like each of the panel members, please, just to introduce yourself. We'd love to know a little bit about your organisation and why you were there and what you were hoping to achieve while you were at COP15. So Rachel Lowry, over to you first.
Thanks, Jodie, and hello all. I'm zooming in from Wurundjeri country today, down here in Melbourne. I was there because I was hoping to be part of a historical moment where, globally around the world, 196 governments representing countries that were there to make change ultimately landed a new deal for people and nature. And WWF is the organisation I was representing. I joined the WWF contingent over there, so the delegation was around about 60 people from all over the globe. They're trying to provide intel and insights each day. We met very early every morning. We met again each night, and we had WhatsApp firing the entire time. And the aim was to help connect other ministers to our minister if we needed a little bit more pressure on the Australian government or a little bit more inspiration provided around targets. And equally, vice versa, we were able to give our minister feedback and say, hey, I think you need to have a chat to this nation over here because they're not as inspired by this target as you are, and hearing that come from Australia may give them the confidence. So we wanted to see a new deal for people and nature. Wasn't perfect, but we did get a new deal, and there were times there when it was looking shaky. So it was great to be a part of it. And I echo your words, Jodie. It was so good to be part of Team Australia and work with you all.
Thanks, Rachel. James.
Thanks, Jodie. And I'm also calling in from Wurundjeri country. Very similar to Rachel. So I work for the Nature Conservancy. We're a global non-government organisation, much like WWF, and had similar objectives, I think. And I was part of a contingent of a mix of our global policy folks, some of our technical staff, and some of our country and regional staff that attended. And I was really going there from an Australian perspective, but also to talk, I guess, ahead of the negotiations around 30 by 30, some of these targets, how they can be achieved by bringing practical examples to the fore to show that this, while might seem daunting, and the big targets that have been set can also be achievable as well. And so it was a nice mix. We globally, we went in with the ambitions of achieving that 30 by 30 target, which we'll talk about later, as well as resource mobilisation to really think about how do we plug this $700 billion a year gap that we have for conservation. And I think overall the Conservancy felt that this was a historic agreement, but really the real work is now to be done to get there.
Yeah,
Thanks,
absolutely. It is. Sam.
Thanks, Jodie. Hi, everyone. I'm calling in from a beautiful day at Biripi country up mid-north coast of New South Wales. And I'm head of conservation and science at BirdLife Australia. So BirdLife, much like previous two speakers, it's a global partnership. It's actually one of the largest global conservation partnerships in the world. And so I was there to join my colleagues from many of the other nature and bird conservation organisations around the globe. And as Rachel and James have just said, to sort of, facilitate those conversations. Not everything that countries want to say sit on the floor. And so a lot of those conversations happen in the margins of the actual negotiations, and civil society plays a really, really important role. So much is actually decided. It always amazes me that so much is left to these conferences. The details are really thrashed out in those couple of weeks where everyone's sort of getting together finally and not just chatting digitally and online. So that's a really important role that we all played, and much like others have said, sort of lending a shoulder to the wheel of Team Australia. And, part of it was being prepared to activate our supporters back home if Australian government wasn't sort of, was playing up somewhere or not quite as ambitious as we hoped. But actually that really wasn't needed. And I think, it was historic in the global deal, but also working with the Australian government this time. It was really, really great to have such an ambitious, hardworking delegation to work alongside. And I think, someone who's been involved with CBD for a long time, that was really a proud moment. I think that one of the things that's important for BirdLife globally is that we have built our global strategy around our contribution to CBD. So we built that sort of based on the zero draft of the Global Biodiversity Framework, and hoping to keep the ambition up there. And also, I guess one of the things that birds do is they're a really great indicator of the health of the planet and can tell us how we're tracking against some of those targets. So really lent in on monitoring and evaluation. And James, as you said, like some of the, bringing that kind of experience as to how these goals and targets can be achieved.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kelly.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly Chelsea. I'm fortunate to be Chief Executive of the Australian Conservation Foundation, which is...
Sorry, Kelly, I'd hate to interrupt. I just want to check on your sound. It was working earlier.
Oh, you can't hear?
Yep, we've got you now. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Great. Kelly, Australian Conservation Foundation. The National Environment Group of Australia, so not an international group. And unlike these incredible people that are here in front of you and their organisations, we didn't have the ability to join with many other forces around the world to influence the agreement. So we were there for quite a different reason. Before I say that, I just wanted to say that it was incredible work by these groups, particularly international groups, and they had such a huge influence on the outcome. They have bigger contingencies there than the Australian government, and all credit to their work. We were there because in Australia, we're not having a conversation about nature or the extinction crisis. Oops, some people are saying they can't hear me. I'll finish this and then try and fix it. We wanted to raise attention in this country about the extinction crisis, about the global agreement, and then bring that global agreement back here to deliver it in Australia. And so we were really intent on raising awareness in the media in Australia to cover it. The Australian media did not go to Montreal, so we did it for them. And we brought the stories back and did the stories live for the few others here. And of course, we're also there because there's a big business contingent, and ACF does a lot of work on moving the money from damage to nature protection, and we wanted to influence those businesses there.
Thanks, Kelly. It was cutting a little bit in and out when you leaned backward and forward. So maybe put some headphones or something in if you can, or lean a bit closer to the screen when we get you back up next time. And feel free to repeat a little bit of that when we get back to your targets in a little while. So I'd like now, that was really fantastic. And I think it really was great just reflecting on some of the commentary there that as a group, we were all leaning in different areas. We all had strengths of our organisations with focuses on often similar, but often strengths in different places. And one of the great things was the ability for us as a group to coordinate around that, to let those with particular areas that they wanted to lean into that and play to those strengths to have the best possible outcome we could have in our engagements at COP. So it was great to coordinate together. James, I'm going to move into some of the targets in detail now, and in particular, it'd be great to talk to you about targets 2 and 3. And so I'm going to put the targets up onto the screen so that you can see these, because they are wordy, they're lengthy, so they will be on the screen for each of the targets that we're going to talk to. And as I said, we're not going to talk to all of them. But James, target 2 is an important one, and you know what some consider is to be a relatively new one. Can you outline the target and particularly what is it trying to achieve, and what might success look like if we are to achieve that target?
Thanks, Jodie. Well, target 2, let's call it the restoration target, and it probably received a fair bit less publicity going into the Global Biodiversity Framework than the perhaps more sexy target 3, the 30 by 30. But this has become quite a dramatic target. So there was a similar target under the previous decade's target, but it was aiming for 15% restoration. What the parties have done has really scaled up ambition here to talk about 30% restoration of degraded terrestrial, inland water and coastal and marine ecosystems. Now that is, in anyone's mind, a pretty big target, and something that's going to, I suspect, tax the minds of certainly the Australian government and state governments going forward, because probably right now we don't have a plan for national restoration in the same way we do for, say, our protected area establishment and growth. This is something that we might have maps for as part of state of environments, for instance, but we don't really have national policies, and certainly not targets at this level of scale and ambition. So to me, this will be one of the targets that will really require some serious policy development and thinking and good science input to work out how we get anywhere near a target of 30% restoration by 2030, saying we have only got 7 years left to go. Now, probably most of our restoration, when we think about that, occurs on land at the moment. And we know that marine restoration is still pretty young and still done at quite a small scale. So there's some real work to be done there to think about that very clear differentiation there made between terrestrial, inland waters and coastal going forward. And while the convention is all about biodiversity, typically for its own right, you've also got references to ecosystem functions and services here as well. And other factors around integrity and connectivity. So factoring all those different elements into a plan, a strategy that deals with a target of 30% restoration by 2030 is going to be a reasonable task. There's probably going to be a lot of definitional discussions too here is what counts as a degraded ecosystem. Are we talking about farmland that's been totally cleared? Or is that off the agenda? Are we talking about native vegetation that might be slightly degraded? Is that what we're talking about? So some of these definitional issues are going to be really, really important to work out how we progress along this target going forward.
Thanks, James. And how far away are we, do you think, on that pathway to kind of grappling with some of those definitional issues?
I think we're still a reasonable way away from a national strategy around it, is my feeling. Interestingly, under the previous decade's worth of targets on this particular topic, which was a 15% target, only about 50% of countries reported on it, and it was well underdone. And I actually don't think Australia was one that reported a great deal on it. So I do think this is going to be a step up for Australia to collectively, amongst the states, territories and federal government, to think about how do we do this in a national manner. But I do think the appetite's there. I mean, we know that there is, I guess, with various other strategies, we have a desire to increase habitat, to improve habitat, possibly doesn't call out restoration as much as this target is, but by default, bringing some of those different strategies together in a more cohesive picture is what's going to be required. But I do think that with the next biodiversity strategy that we have for the country, restoration is going to have a very clear focus to meet this target.
Yeah, absolutely. So James, or maybe Rachel, how important then, we talked about this being particularly ambitious, how important is the restoration target on its own in achieving the overarching 2030 mission? Because there's a lot of targets here to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, to put nature on a path to recovery for the benefit of people and planet. How important is this particular target in achieving that mission?
I'll have a quick go then throw to Rachel. I think it's really, really important, Jodie. I mean, to me, which other targets we haven't talked about yet, but the I guess halting extinctions target is going to be an important end result of some of this work. It's getting more habitat back in the system, healthier habitat back in the system is going to be fundamental to maintain our species and see no species lost. But over to you, Rachel.
Yeah, no, I concur. And this was almost dubbed as a bit of the icon target going into the negotiations. There was a lot of hope put on place behind this target because we wanted to make sure we left with at least this, what I'm calling like the insurance policy, you know, that we've got actual, you know, representation of inland water, of coastal marine environments, of landscapes effectively managed at a decent enough percentage. So that it's important to have the target one because it's specific. We know exactly where we are today and we know what we're talking about in regards to scale, which pieces of landscape, etc. Sure, that still needs to be worked out. But I would also argue, I don't want to overstate the importance of this target because there's another 70% of ocean and landscapes and freshwater out there that we need to make sure that we're not thinking, oh, well, we've got this locked and secured, and so therefore we don't have to worry about what happens with the other 70%. So this is important in the context of all the targets getting the attention that they need in its own right. It's a great step forward, but we can't just ignore the other 70%.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. And I think that's a good segue as well across to target 3, James, known widely as the 30 by 30 target. It's been considered a pinnacle of the framework. So can you tell us more about that and why it is and has been one of those most well-known targets in the framework?
Yeah, thanks, Jodie. So since the Convention on Biological Diversity was first signed up, creating protected area networks has been a critical part of the convention. And over time, the percentage target has grown. So originally there was a 10% target. Then in the previous decade, it was 17% on land and 10% in oceans. And globally, we've recognised, though, that's not nearly enough. And there's been a real push to get to a target that's more, I guess, coherent, more consistent with what biodiversity needs. And so 30% is the target, or at least 30%. And importantly here, it's been called out that this is 30% of terrestrial and inland water and coastal and marine areas. And it's not a collective 30% of the globe that are coming together. There's, as you say, there's lots of text here and it looks daunting, and to some extent it is. A lot of this text, though, has carried over, has been used as part of a similar target for the past 25 years since the convention's been in existence. So a lot of this is not new. The need for a representative protected area estate, well-connected, thinks about areas of importance for biodiversity. Those are all fundamental concepts of protected area and reserve design. Indeed, been part of the fundamental, I guess, policy, science-based policy in Australia since we came up with strategies to create a national reserve system. What is new, I guess, is that the raised ambition for the percent of the target, which is ambitious, absolutely. And I'll talk more about where does Australia sit in the globe in a minute. There are some other new components too that are worth noting here, and that is the increased recognition of Indigenous and traditional territories, which is really important. But also probably added late in the piece, and perhaps a surprise to many, was the issue of the sustainable use where appropriate and consistent with conservation outcomes. And that's going to be one that a definition around what does that look like will have to come into play. And I'm sure that's going to be quite a different interpretation, not only within countries, but between countries as well, as to how that looks. So there's some additional measures. This is not just about protected areas. This is about a category or a group of categories called other effective area-based conservation measures, which is basically OECMs. It's things that are achieving biodiversity outcomes in a secure sense that aren't protected areas, that are outside of the protected area system. So this target is important in terms of where we are globally at the moment. So Australia has 22% of our land surface under protection. So we've got to get another 8% by 2030 to meet the target. In oceans, we have 40% of our territorial waters, but it's worth noting, though, that only about 12% of that is in highly protected marine protected areas. And so there's probably still some way to go to increase the representation of our MPA estate as well. Globally, there's going to be a bit of a lift. I mean, globally, there's 17% protected on land and only 7.7 in the ocean. So there's still some work to be done there, I think it's fair to say. Again, in Australia, we think about this in terms of a representative, comprehensive and adequate reserve system. So we have a lot of policies, good science-based policies that states, non-government organisations, the federal government and others have been using for decades now to guide how the reserve system expands. And those are really fundamental to growing this system, that we don't just think about the 30% figure in its own right. It's a robust network that's connected, that's ecologically representative and equitably governed as well.
Fantastic. And we've got existing frameworks, as you say, that we can apply and that we can use to meet that target: public estate, private estate and Indigenous protected areas that already exist. I'm going to move us on to the next question. Thank you, James, for helping us understand those two important ones. So target 4, Rachel, target 4 is also a long one. There's lots of words in these targets, isn't there? But an important one that drives actions to halt human-induced extinction. So can you describe the different elements of this target in practical terms?
Yes, this was another one that I think many that went to the COP had high hopes for. And I think if we're going to call targets 2 and 3 sort of icon targets, where we recognise we need to protect, like under target 3, we need to restore under target 2. Even if we do that and we get that right, there's recognition that doesn't mean that we will stop seeing species being pushed over that extinction line. So this target is effectively your threatened species target. And it has, the words do matter, and this is the challenge with COPs, that sometimes you'll see an argument last for almost 3 days on the sidelines over the inclusion of one word. What I love seeing in this particular target, if we unpack it, is that human-wildlife conflict has been recognised. It's the first time, I believe, in any CBD target we've seen actual explicit recognition of human-wildlife conflict. So that means you've got 196 countries around the world that have signed up to ensuring coexistence between human and wildlife. So that's nice. In situ and ex situ recovery in there. A lot of people really wanted to see in situ recovery, the recovery that happens out there in the wild, prioritised in the language. It's actually the role of ex situ recovery is extremely important, because we're talking about species that we might be bringing into our zoos and sanctuaries or managed within reserves. But ultimately the real win, if we win this target because we've brought everything into our zoos, I don't think anyone would say that that's was the aim of this target. So there was some criticism around that piece. What I think is most important is this is the only target that has the word urgent in it. And that word urgent is in there because there was a lot of negotiation in the final 2 days around whether or not this target should be quite bold. And because we're talking about known threatened species, part of the argument was, well, we know now, we've got the data, we know they're in trouble now, why are we waiting till 2030 to ensure that they're not going extinct? Really from a first principles ethical mindset, wouldn't we be doing everything we can from today to prevent extinctions? And so there was a lot of argy-bargy around that. And I will give Australia, our Australian government credit there. They really pushed for effective immediately for zero extinctions. And it's not an easy one to win, but it's the right defensible target. It's not where it landed, but there was recognition that there's urgent management actions that need to take place right now. And so, good to see that word urgent in there, but a lot of criticism around the fact that it didn't land as zero extinctions effective immediately. Might leave it there. There is lots to unpack in there, but it's landed where it's landed. And I think domestically, we can recognise that we do have a zero extinctions target here in Australia, effective immediately. Great words to have on a page, but what we do with that is the question.
How we get there, yeah, absolutely. And how we make that real and realised here in Australia. One more question about this one that, maybe is for yourself or for Sam. What are some of the major drivers of extinction that we might need to address here in Australia for us to be successful in this target?
Yeah, no worries. I'll have a quick one that, feral species, land clearing. We've got to now have a look at threatened species recovery from a warming context, climate change as well, of course. But Sam lives and breathes this every day with bird lice. I'm going to throw to her to see if she wants to add any other drivers in there, because we're not short of them, sadly.
No, we're not. Thanks, Rachel. And look, I can probably speak for the birds with more authority, but exactly as you say, like globally, you know, we know that one of the biggest drivers is still the loss of habitat, and that's no different in Australia. So 75% of Earth's surface has been modified for humans. That doesn't leave a lot left for our wildlife. So habitat certainly is habitat destruction, active destruction right now is certainly driving down populations, particularly of threatened species that are you know, being squeezed from all angles, and you know, that includes, as you say, invasive species. And we are seeing climate change impacts starting to bite right now. So, you know, mega fires, we're seeing, you know, temperature changes, you know, that the effects are actually of a changing climate are having effects now.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Rachel, target 10. This is another long set of words. Can you break this one down for us? What's the target seeking to achieve, again, in those real and practical terms?
So let's call this one our sustainable sort of agriculture target. And this is about acknowledging that what we do with our productive landscapes matters. And, you know, in a time when we know that we're going to have population growth, we're going to have to produce more food. There was great aspirations from WWF globally that we would get some very strong sort of transformational systems change language coming through this target. It just didn't quite land that way. Also, the target is a little rubbery, so we've got substantial increase. Could you imagine, if you think back to James's targets 2 and 3 before, you talked about why is the target important? We know what we're going for. Right across the globe, 30% restoration, 30% protection. We know where we are and where we've got to go. Is substantial 1%? Is it 10%? Is it 15%? It's sort of been criticised, this one, as perhaps not being as smart a target as we needed. But ultimately, it's good to see agroecology in there, and there's a lot more work to do to make sure that we're shining the spotlight on the need to just get better in the way that we're managing our productive landscapes, so that we can get those dual wins for nature and for productivity. That's what this one's all about. What do I want to call out there? There's a few criticisms of this target, that it's not really explicit that it's all sustainably managed sort of productive areas. You know, it does specifically call out agriculture, aquaculture, fisheries and forestry. I think we have to interpret it that it's all productive landscapes based on this one.
Yeah, thank you. Heaps more I'd love to do to dive into the target, and we might come back to some of these if there's no questions from the audience, but if the audience gets active and chit-chatty, we may or may not be able to come back to each of these targets. I'd like to move on to you, Kelly, and to test your mic out for us.
How are we going?
We've got you that bit. Let's hope it stays that way. If we start going like this, just lean forward a little bit. Yep, that's it. So, Kelly, target 15. So we've moved into the tools and solutions. Can you outline the key elements of target 15? We didn't hear quite from the beginning, but maybe just reaffirm one of the reasons you were over there, what this is trying to achieve and why this was such a significant target that not only was important, but also shaped the audience in Montreal.
Yes, so at Montreal, in the first few days, there was several thousand businesses there actually, and they had a big conference, and it was very constructive, which is not always what we experience at COPs, whether it's climate or nature COPs. So that was a really big change in this COP. One of the reasons why we were there is to really make sure this target got up, because this is really about moving the money. This is about changing how businesses operate, because we know the way that we run our economy and the way that businesses operate on this planet is destroying nature. And we need to shift that if we are to meet any of those goals. And so often environment groups focus on governments. And of course, nature is something we all share is a public good, and that's absolutely appropriate that we focus on governments, and we will continue to do that. But we also need business to change, and we need business to invest in good, in nature regeneration, in forms of agriculture, for example, that are nature positive. And how they do that is by understanding first the impact that they have on nature. They disclose publicly the risks and the damage they do to nature and their dependencies on nature. And that's what this target is all about, requiring significantly large and multinational businesses to disclose their nature risks and dependencies. And if they can do that, then we know publicly what impact banks, superannuation funds, agricultural, food production organisations are having on nature, how reliant they are on nature, which of course is heavily. And they can start putting in place targets to get to nature positive, like we do for net zero targets for climate. So this is very much following the climate disclosure rules and frameworks and commitments that are being put in place for nature. It was a bloody annoying target to watch be created. I'm not sure there is a target that was developed that was not annoying to watch, but the business community stood up and said, make it mandatory. We want the business community to have to disclose our nature risks. And I think you can read this target in a few different ways, but it does lack the word mandatory. That is something we need to do. But in good news, a lot of the frameworks are now being developed internationally to undertake this target. And essentially, this is about changing how business does business so it's nature positive.
Yeah, and so we saw all of that globally while we were over this massive movement of people. What happens in Australia now, obviously, will be important to how we achieve our goals here in Australia. So where are we on that pathway to implementation here, and what still needs to happen if we're going to get there?
Well, while we were over there, actually, the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, announced that he will make climate disclosures mandatory in 2024 for Australian businesses. And I imagine they'll make it mandatory for different levels of polluters, for example. He also flagged the intent to do that for nature risks, but I don't think that'll be in 2024. One of the reasons is because we're still developing the global frameworks for nature risk and disclosure. But we need to ramp up the pressure right now to get nature disclosure happening a lot faster than it took for climate risk and disclosure. So it's happening. But I talk to the bank CEOs, the super funds, their investment committees. We're putting a lot of pressure on them to start disclosing their nature risk, and all of them have said they will. And I think they are quite serious about it, but they're just so much further behind in terms of nature than they are on climate. So we've got a lot of work to do to really ramp up the importance of nature in this country, both to business and to the Australian people.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of work to do, that's for sure, on all of these. So target 18, this will be the last target we'll dive into any detail on. It addresses another key driver of biodiversity loss. Can you outline this target in the same way? What's it trying to achieve? And give some examples, if you can, of how harmful incentives are leading to biodiversity loss in Australia.
Yeah, so this target is all, again, a move the money target, but it's much more focused really on government money. And so in the world and in Australia, we're using public money, public funds to subsidise activities that are damaging to nature, to subsidise forestry and logging, to subsidise agriculture, land clearing, and of course climate. I know that one off by heart. There's $22,000 a minute that goes into making coal and gas cheaper in Australia and the use of diesel. So we really need to shift those subsidies so that governments are supporting activities that are good, that are nature positive, that are climate net zero. And so that's what this is all about. It's a funny language to eliminate and phase out and reform incentives. We usually think about the words incentives as something positive, but incentives can incentivize bad as well. And that's what this is about. I would say in Australia, there's not a lot of conversation about this, including from our own organisations, or at least mine. We're very well across the climate subsidies that happen. And the federal budget is next Tuesday, which I'll be in Canberra for, and we'll be once again calling for the reduction of the $12 billion of subsidies that goes into fossil fuels in Australia. I think we really need to ramp up the work on understanding nature's subsidies and shifting those.
And wouldn't it be nice to see more positive incentives
Yeah.
for conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity? On that question, Kelly, and then maybe open it up to any other panel member before we finish up on the targets. How do we scale up either positive incentives or, as per the previous target, positive investment into conservation and sustainable use for biodiversity?
Well, I think that target 15 is an incredibly important way to scale up the private investment, because it will change the way that you grow food, produce food in the world, for example. But, oops, my earphone, I'm not having a very good day today. My earphone's just fallen out. Anyway, but I think we've got a really big discussion to have about how we do that for nature for public money. We can keep asking for the $2 billion a year that we need in public funds to end extinction and to help threatened species recover. But over and over and over and over, the government just hasn't done that and doesn't find the money to do that. So I think we need to develop more innovative ways on the public front to do that. ACF was involved in the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and forming that 10 years ago, $10 billion of public money that is used to leverage 10 times that much of private money for climate action. I think, those are the sorts of things we really need to start getting innovative around, and not just keep doing things the same way that we have, because we're just going to get governments say, we don't have any money anymore, although they're investing a lot in submarines. And I think nature is the death by 1,000 cuts. It's something that often is seen as a future problem, even though we're seeing extinction crisis now and the impact of activities now. It's not something that ever really gets to the top of government money. So we're going to have to get our little organisations or big organisations' brains together and figure out more innovative ways of unlocking that public money for nature.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. We might see if we get time to come back to that question, because I think it's an important one. But I would like to make sure that we have time, Sam, to talk about how do we know if we're getting there? How do we know if we're on track? Is that important? Can you describe the monitoring framework for us and tell us what's important about that?
Yeah, I think it's really important, and I think it's one of certainly there are a few reasons why we didn't meet the previous strategies, goals and targets, but accountability is certainly one of them. So just by way of introduction, the monitoring framework for the global biodiversity framework is sort of set up primarily to reach three objectives. It's to allow countries to continue to assess their own progress towards the goals and targets. It's set up this time to allow us to try and measure some global progress towards the goals and targets, and also to allow national progress to be compared amongst countries. And so to do this, we've got a suite of indicators that some of them have been or will be agreed, so that we can actually measure how we're tracking over the next decade or what's left. So just to, whistle-stop sort of tour, some people may have heard of these headline indicators, and they're the ones which all nations should be required to report on, and they're designed so that they can actually be aggregated to, assess our progress together as nations and parties to the convention. And these are going to be complemented by what's called component indicators, which are really just about nations being able to, or regions being able to, track progress in a bit more detail, and complementary indicators, which are really allowing that sort of deeper dive into, what has worked as we try and make progress towards these goals.
Great, thank you. So how's that different from previous strategic plans and our methods for tracking success, for example, of the HE targets? And what can we learn from that? What do we need to do this time around?
Yeah, so just as I hinted, that I think lack of accountability is one of the reasons it's broadly agreed that we failed to meet the HE targets in the previous strategy. So of course, it wasn't just that not enough resources were mobilised, as James was talking about before. A critical component is getting enough resources to make it real, and having, you know, enough political will, you know, to make those nature commitments, to take them seriously, whole of government sort of commitments, and across all of our sectors. But you know, I think it's often the, you know, ability to celebrate outstanding contributions or the lack of progress that environment departments themselves and civil society can use to actually put pressure on whether it's the government, other portfolios, to just really drive a response. So the fact that they weren't really measurable, a lot of the targets sort of did set sort of what they wanted to see, the Aichi targets, but they weren't, they've been widely criticised as not really being measurable enough. And not having those regular check-ins to see how we're going, it sort of took away that opportunity to you know, to have those conversations about how we were tracking. And we didn't really have a previous framework that was designed to assess actual impact. So, you know, what were the actual conservation outcomes? So, for example, just, you know, when we're talking about protected areas, a nation could designate a set-aside area for biodiversity, but there wasn't really any direct link to say, is that an area that's important, of particular importance for biodiversity or not? So that was in the text, but there's no metric to say whether or not we were making progress there, or whether formally protecting an area would actually prevent biodiversity loss that would otherwise be at risk, or if areas were even effectively managed at all. So, you know, I guess what we learned is that the targets, they were sort of articulating some endpoints, but, you know, that some of them were quite ambiguous. They lacked specificity, they didn't have quantifiable objectives or baselines, so to see how we were tracking.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Sam. I think that's really helpful for the audience to get an understanding of the role that the framework plays here. So thanks, panel. We've had the opportunity to but to skim the surface really of these targets, and only some of the targets. We've got a couple of questions in the Q&A panel. We've actually got quite a few, well, some of it's question and answer, so thanks, Tim, for helping to answer some of the questions, but it's around agroecology, and it relates probably more to target 10. So what the question there is particularly, what is included in agroecology? And are there any good working examples of this? Tim advises agroecology is a holistic and integrated approach that simultaneously applies ecological and social concepts and principles to design and management of sustainable ag and food. And there's a set of principles there. But I wonder, Rachel, it was target 10 was your area, but open to anyone else that might want to lean into that question.
Yeah, look, one of the examples that comes to mind, so agroecology, it's looking at that agricultural environmental interface, how we manage our waste, how we manage our water on productive lands, how we're making sure that we're looking for the win-wins and getting ourselves out of the depletive, extractive cycles, more into the regenerative practices. Deforestation-free beef is one that comes to my mind. You know, beef production in Australia is a driver, mass driver of land clearing. The thing that really bugs me about that is that there are cattle grazers and pastoralists out there that are applying themselves to produce beef and have deforestation-free beef and conversion-free beef. That it can be done. But right now, you and I go to the supermarket and there's no differentiation in market, so we can reward those pastoralists that are doing it the right way rather than you know, the extractive depletive way. So that's just one example I can think of, and it sort of links back to one of your questions earlier, Jodie, as well, around financing. We have to get better at empowering everyday Australians to be able to reward those that are doing the right thing, and that drives market-based changes. But at the moment, we're just lacking so much transparency across our system, so we've got to work on that.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Just open in case anyone else wanted to explore that question further. Otherwise, there's a couple of questions here that also being asked. So will anyone on the panel call for the elimination of subsidies for unsustainable forestry, in brackets, most of forestry?
I'll call for it.
Yep.
Yeah, it's something that a lot of ENGOs are looking at. I had a meeting the other day with WWF Netherlands, who are right now trying to trace the money around key drivers of deforestation and look at who's subsidising these practices and making sure that, again, we're building transparency into that system. So there's a lot of work in this space, and I would say keep an eye out, because I think we're going to see a lot more in Australia over coming years, particularly as we get closer towards 2030 and we're not seeing the type of action and implementation that's following some of the global commitments we're signing on to around the world, like Glasgow.
And I'd add that ACF's doing a lot on deforestation or land clearing, which is different to forestry. And other groups are doing a lot on forestry, and particularly the Wilderness Society, who are not here. And yes, that will include both the subsidies, the approvals of them, but also who's funding them. So that's the banks and the superannuation groups that are providing the funding, and we're starting to call that out through reports analysis, and then putting pressure on them that they are funding extinction by funding deforestation, as are governments by subsidising it and shifting that money into protection rather than destruction.
Thank you. I'm going to take it back a question back to the agroecology, because I did miss, sorry, a particular specific question that wasn't an answer there, Tim, from you, which was, I guess, wondering about, from the organisations getting more practical and on the ground that are around the room, how those organisations represented on the panel are going to help drive the transition to agroecological principles and practices in Australia. Now, I note that there are many thousands of landholders across Australia that are undertaking agroecological principles and practices, and the significant role that productive landholders play in stewarding land into the future. So what functions and roles are some of your organisations, noting there's many organisations working out in this space, but in particular your organisations playing in this space?
I might quickly jump in, Jody. So look, I mean, agroecology can go under different names. Regen Ag's a pretty, important name out there as well at the moment. I think a general, more sustainable view of agriculture in line with natural elements, I think, is going to be sort of important. We've been working closely with the Narri Tribal Council at Guyaini to look at what is a really large restoration expanse of 88,000 hectares, and how can we utilise grazing, which has an economic income stream, as well as using that as an ecological tool to help this regeneration event over such a large area to control weeds, etc. And at the same time help actually promote restoration of natural vegetation. That's kind of one example, but we're certainly looking at other parts of, say, the Murray-Darling Basin as examples of where that can be applied, where you can have the net double benefit of economic income, of, say, food production, as well as enhancing our natural ecosystems at the same time. So there's a lot of interest in doing that. I think there's going to be a lot of experimentation and lots of trialing, lots of science, but I think the intent is there for many landowners to move towards that basis.
Yeah, thanks, James.
Did you want to jump in, Jody? Or
yeah, go Rachel, and then Sam quickly, and then one more quick question.
Look, I might just mention it at WWF, which has recently been doing a listening exercise and looking at which are, across regenerative agriculture, the biggest levers that would get us most impact towards 2030 and meeting these goals. Our new strat plan, which we'll launch in the coming months, will focus on sustainable beef industry in Australia, because it is a big one that we need to focus on. And so that will be around not just shining the spotlight on the issue here, but also working with industry to find solutions. So we have a partnership with Meat and Livestock Australia. You've got to actually start with common language. What do we actually mean by conversion-free, deforestation-free beef? So we've actually got a partnership established to do some of that work, for example, to get some of the baseline data. How do we get the incentives happening? So we're looking at some like export legislation into EU, Japan, other areas, so that, you know, if there's no market, people, or if there is a really strong market for deer-free beef, people will move quicker. And then on blue foods, I don't want to take our eye off oceans as well, getting more traceability. Like there's an initiative that we have helped found called OpenSC. And, you know, we're hoping that sort of using that blockchain technology will empower everyday Australians in supermarkets to be able to go, all right, I know exactly where this seafood was caught. It's ethical. It's been, or it might be an aquaculture So anyway, there's lots going out there. We could spend a whole day on this one, but I am seeing more and more representatives of civil society getting in the problem solving space like James just referred to, and no doubt others are working on.
Great, thanks, Rachel. And Sam, very quickly, did you have one more tiny thing to add there?
Oh, just if it's tiny, yeah. So we're working directly through our Birds on Farms program with farmers who actually want to take action on their farms to look after birds. Excellent. Providing them the support that they need, whether it be expertise or financial support to do the work they want to do.
Yeah, great. So from the really systems thinking change, systems change through to the practical on ground work and support. So finally, really quickly, maybe can you do this one quickly, Kelly? Perhaps because we just heard from everyone else, keen to understand what role a circular economy approach would or will play in meeting targets discussed today.
Well, circular economy is harder in Australia because we're at the bottom end of the world and at the end of a lot of chains. So it's hard for us to drive a circular economy. We don't make cars, for example. We take the cars, it's pretty hard to drive that. So that in the bigger meta systems level change, it's challenging here. But in food, it's very interesting, and food having the biggest impact on habitat in Australia, as Rachel has pointed out, particularly beef. We can drive a lot of change there. We're also very important to the world's climate with the coal and gas that we export to the world. So circular economy, if I'm not incorrect, is actually mentioned in the, which people fought hard to have in the framework. I think it is an important concept because if it just changes the way you think. If you think we live on a single planet, that planet has a society of people that interact, and they do that through an economy, trade goods and services, very simplistic. No, that's not exactly how it works. You can think, if you think through that way, you would protect the planet a lot more than we currently do. And if you think through the way of a circular economy where the thing at the end is not a waste, but it's a resource to put back in to the planet, which can't get rid of the waste, you would change the way that you would produce food in the first place, energy in the first place. So I think, to be honest, the mindset change that we need to go through about nature, about how we change the biggest drivers of nature destruction or habitat destruction. I don't use the word loss because you lose your keys, but you don't lose nature because you did it on purpose. We did it on purpose, made decisions. We can change those decisions. So I do think it'll be important, but I'm not sure for someone who loves it. I've talked about this for as long as I've been working on the environment, which as long as I've been an adult. Sometimes these theoretical things get a bit lost, and we have to just put them into the practical campaigns, even if they're at the systems level that Rachel just identified that we work on at ACF. They're still driving big outcomes now. And so applying that principle of circular economy to how we produce food, how we stop forestry, how we move incentives is important. I'm not convinced it's the most important thing at this time, though. I don't know if others have a different view.
Well, thank you. I'd like to explore others' views, but we are going to be cut short on time. And again, another conversation for an entirely full day workshop. Thanks for those great questions from the audience. Really appreciated your engagement to extend the discussions even further. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. It has been really great having your inputs, your questions. We've been able to deepen the discussions. Our panel, each of you for your time and experience in sharing those opportunities, the challenges ahead. It's all really important, and I recognise the work that each of you do in your own organisations and in your own lives in delivering significant outcome for biodiversity in Australia. There were still a few more people that were in Montreal over there with us from Australia, and heaps more targets to get through. So if you're really keen to hear more, put a thumbs up in the chat and let us know that you want us to run another one of these webinars. As I said, there may still be time to squeeze one more in the next month. Failing that, we also have an opportunity to come together and talk further about this at the ACIUCN Global Biodiversity Framework Workshop, which will be at the end of the month in Canberra. I think the dates are the 31st of May to the 1st of June on Ngunnawal country. So if you hadn't heard about that or want to come along to that, Phoebe might be able to put that in the chat with a link to that. Otherwise, get in touch with the ACIUCN to find out more and dive even further into the discussion about the Global Biodiversity Framework and what it means for us here in Australia, which is really important. Can't wait to speak to you all again. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Jodie, for organising.